Hi, everyone. We're now ready to get started with our next session for the day. Our next session is a panel discussion on the growth and impact of the Women's Big Bash League. Our panelists for this session are Mary Constantopoulos, founder of the Ladies Who League, a website to encourage women to become involved in sport as both participants and commentators. Through panels of women sports commentators in podcasts and on Twitter, she brings the voices and perspectives of women to this previously male-dominated area. Ms. Constantopoulos writes for the NRL.com, The Roar, and creates a weekly podcast interviewing female athletes and sits on the LBW Trust, the Full Stop Foundation, and the NRL's Women in League Sports. We now have Bhavi Devchand, Australian cricketer and coach, who spent 10 years in domestic cricket in Australia, representing the Western Australia and Victoria in the WNCL and the Perth Scorchers and the Melbourne Stars in the WBBL. She spent a lot of time as a coach, working with cricketers in junior and senior state teams on their physical and mental skills. Ms. Devchand has worked closely with Australian Cricketers Association to assist in their world-class programs to help players' development off-field. Through her business and podcast, The Inside Edge Project, she connects with other female cricketers and coaches to help encourage the next generation to continue to break stereotypes and enjoy themselves along the way. And our moderator for the event is Ms. Zinya Dikana, sports journalist at The Scroll. If you have any questions during the session, please type them in the question and answer box below, and our panelists will try to answer them at the end of the session. Over to you, Zinya.
Thank you, Yogita. Hi, Mary. Hi, Bhavi. Lovely to have you here. Talking about something which I'm sure a lot of us have questions about, the Women's Big Bash League. Now, Cricket Australia has really set the benchmark for women's cricket and even women's sport with this league. It started as tied in with the men's league. It had this first ever concept of umbrella branding, where the 8 teams were the same as the men's team, to where it has grown as a standalone version now. And both of you have been part of this journey, have witnessed this growth. And I'd love for you to describe how WBBL grew from the first 15-16 season to a standalone version now, both as a player and as somebody who's seen it through the media. Over to you.
I'm happy to give it a crack first. I mean, for me, when I first started playing, I didn't even know the WA women's team existed. So this was 2004 was my first season of cricket. So I was just playing because my brother played, and that was about it. And it actually took me 2 or 3 years, and I was still playing state underage programs, which was a really good setup. But still at that point, I had no idea that the women's state team existed. Now I go back and look at the girls that were my age, 11 or 12, and they're all running around in Perth Scorchers or Melbourne Stars shirts. And their leagues are called the Perth Scorchers Girls League. So they play in their whole league is the Perth Scorchers Girls under 13s, under 15s, under 17s. And the whole model is completely shifted now. And the other thing that when I started playing, there were only 4 teams, women's teams in WA, where Perth's pretty small compared to Sydney and Melbourne. Now there's hundreds. So every single suburb has multiple teams. And the growth for me, the changing point was entirely due to the WBBL. And I'm sure Mary would have a really great insight in terms of the opposite side and a media side, and just exploded in that first Big Bash.
Bhavi, meanwhile, could you tell us a bit more? You mentioned about how in the first season you were contracted for 12 hours a week, but it has now changed to a full-time thing. This was something I was curious about, how it has sort of grown into a full-time opportunity for a pro player.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first year we were contracted, what they basically did is you have your state contract, which is the 50 over side of things, and the Big Bash contract. Those 2 things combined probably allowed us to train about 12 hours a week. Most players, to be fair, were still training as if it was full-time. So we'd go to work or go to university, train early morning, late at night. And because at that point, if you wanted to make it, you had to do the work. And like you just cop that, as I've seen in India, the drive is there, you just find a way. But then as each year, huge thanks to the Australian Cricketers Association that did a lot of work with this, we managed to get small amounts of funding that increased up until now, where you're basically full-time for the Big Bash period. So it's not full-time throughout the year, but most cricketers can dedicate those 8 weeks of their lives to being completely full-time. And yeah, I suppose it's made a huge difference from a player's perspective. I don't have to worry about how am I going to pretty much pay my rent, put food on the table. How can I dedicate my mind, body, soul to cricket or training, which is my passion, when I have to go to uni, I have to go to work, I have to support my family or support myself. So that difference has been unbelievable, and it just takes the pressure off. It really does.
What it does is it makes women's sport, women's cricket, a viable career opportunity to, as you say, to pay the bills. Mary, on this note, you mentioned that how Ladies Who League was a passion project. You had this was a part-time job for you. From your, as an outsider to the WBBL, sharing those stories, how it has changed from being something which is perhaps a passion project to being a proper profession now, both as a cricketer and a cricket follower.
Absolutely. And I just want to apologise. I'm extremely embarrassed that my audio wasn't working, but I'm really happy to be here. And I just wanted to follow on from what Bhavi was saying initially. Like growing up, I played a lot of sport, but the sports that I loved the most were rugby league and cricket. But growing up as a young girl in Australia, I only associated those sports with men. I didn't know that there were professional women's cricketers. I didn't know that women could play rugby league. So when the WBBL came along, that was my first understanding that, women's cricket actually existed and that there was an Australian women's cricket team. So to see how much Cricket Australia and the state bodies have invested in this competition has been an absolute delight to see. And we can talk about the impact on the next generation of young women coming through who now have the opportunity to dream big and think about playing whatever sport that they want at a professional level. But it also has a really big impact on young men too, because they will grow up in a world where it's just really normal for men and women to play sport. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that's huge. I'm just going to say, like, growing up with my brother as well, in that for us, we just played in the backyard. It didn't matter whether you were a girl or a boy, we mucked around. But then as soon as we were out of that backyard phase, it was like, oh, you're a guy, you can play cricket, and then you're a girl, or shouldn't you be doing X, Y, Z? And I come from a traditional Indian family where my family, immediate family, was fantastic. But a lot of my extended family or the family friends were like, oh, you're still playing cricket. Like, shouldn't you be going to do something else now? And that's the reality of it. So the culture in Australia tends to be so much more open, and this is very generalist, but the culture differences is that what we found in Australia, it's so much more open. And I think a lot of that is still driven, though, by the investment in the game. So even 10 years ago, it's what Mary just said. It was still, oh, that's a boys' sport, and girls, you can go do something else. But having role models to look up to, and now you see a young boy being like wearing an Elise Perry shirt or a Meg Lanning shirt, or even better, it doesn't have to be the big names, even better, Piper Cleary or a Heather Graham. They're not huge names, but they're like, oh yeah, that's great. And it doesn't matter now. And I think that's a big difference.
We're familiar with the sentiment, as you said, Bhavi, but one of the reasons for this could perhaps be the umbrella branding, where the women's teams were the same franchise, the same clubs as the men's. And it seems like a very good template even for us in India. Could you tell us a bit more about how that helped to grow WBBL in the initial years, being part of the same Sydney Sixers club or the same Melbourne Stars club?
Yeah, for sure. I think resource-wise, it helped significantly because the Big Bash was already an established competition in Australia. So then the clubs that so many of us knew, loved and supported then introduced women's teams, and it became one club, two teams, which was something really special. And I remember the Sydney Thunder, they're the club that I support, even though I love all the women's teams. They made a really big deal out of that in their first year and made sure that the men and the women all had separate numbers, because they were one club, two teams. And then I think as well, from a social media perspective, it means that clubs can have a social media account and not only promote the achievements of their men's teams, but also their women's teams as well. So for people that don't know too much about women's cricket or are just getting into it for the first time, it's sort of drip fed into their social media feed and they can become more aware of it. And now, really, the men and the women, they're just one club. When you think about the Sydney Thunder, you think about, your Alex Blackwells, you think about your Samantha Bates. When you think about the Scorchers, you think about, like, Meg Lanning. You think of all these big names. And for me, I think of the women before I think of the men now.
That really helped. There was an audience for it then. Mary, could you tell me a little bit more about the role of media? Because it was an instant success, but not all matches were on TV initially. That was a gradual process. So, from an Australian media perspective, can you tell how the story suddenly came into the mainstream?
What I would say before going on to talking about the broadcast, which has been absolutely significant, particularly now that we've moved the WBBL to being its own standalone competition. It has all eyes on it before the men's competition starts later in the year. But what I would say is the absolute beautiful, genuine, and authentic advantage of female athletes is because so many of them haven't been professional, so many of them still aren't professional. They're often juggling things like families, children, studies, university, and have a richer life experience and richer life understanding. So that makes their stories extremely compelling. And I'm also generalizing here, but maybe Barbie has a bit of an insight as well. I feel like the female athletes have a real genuine interest in making the game better for the next generation. So there's this real piece around legacy, which I don't think is as prominent in men's sport. So when you're sharing the stories of these female athletes, it's compelling because they've got more to offer than just what's happening on the field. Even if I think about Megan Shute, she is a cricketer that I absolutely admire and has been outspoken on a lot of social issues. And I think it's wonderful that our female athletes have the courage to speak up about issues that are important to them and to be completely themselves on the field.
And could you tell us a bit more about the broadcast then, how it came onto the free-to-air channels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the initial stages, not all the games were on television. Some were on live stream only, which in a way was an advantage because it made it accessible to everyone and to people overseas, because I know there's wonderful interest in the WBBL from overseas as well. But over time, I mean, people are watching the Women's Big Bash, people are getting out there, and the quality of female cricket has just continued to rise. And it comes as no surprise to me, given that many of our female cricketers are now professional and have the opportunity to focus on their craft full time. So over time, there's really just been a demand for the women's cricket to be on national television, live, on the main channels, because there's this sort of sense that that's what the women deserve. That's the quality of the cricket. And now people are tuning in from all across the country watching the WBBL, which is incredible given where we started, 7 years ago.
Bhavi, coming to you for an insider's perspective on how this growth came about. You've also been part of 2 clubs, so you have a more well-rounded idea about how it works from within when it comes to this sort of growth in women's cricket.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that first year, when we're talking about the money coming in, and the vast majority comes from the broadcasters, and that's the big importance of it. So that first year, I think there were about 7 to 10 games on Channel 10. And they were very much just happened to be the ones before or after the men's game. So because of that lack of money, it also goes towards the staff. So from a coaching perspective, a management perspective, how much access do we have to the best coaches and the best facilities? And as that started to grow, we started to find that actually there's more money coming in and they're investing more rather than waiting for it to be successful and then we'll invest money. And they invested it initially and we were then able to access. So like for me, I bowl leg spin, for example, we'd have a pace bowling coach, we'd have a leg spin coach. And then I'd be able to access, maybe I can go and train. The Stars were great because we then could train or have access to the men's side of the club. So I was able to then work with Fawad Ahmed, for example. And that was amazing. So he's one of the best 2020 bowlers in the world. Whereas initially it was still very much, you're the woman, you're the men, this is a trial, we're not sure how this is going to happen. Yes, we're part of one club. I think Sydney Thunder probably did it the best, but not all clubs were like that. So Scorchers initially were quite separate, so we'd never really crossed paths too much. But going over to the Stars, it was really quite all one club. The only thing that stopped us this year was the COVID hub, so we actually completely separated in the end. But again, that growth from 1, 2, 3, 4, I missed 5 because I wasn't contracted at that point, but it was really cool in a way because you could see the jump in 2 years. So you had that little bit of perspective and I was like, wow, so I'm in a new club 6 years later. And it's really pleasing to see.
I've still got you, Barbie.
Okay.
You also mentioned, the traditional perceptions that perhaps women's sport is not a career option. How do you see WBBL changing that perception? Because it's right, it's on TV, it's in your newspapers, it's little girls are wearing those jerseys. It is in your face now. It is no longer a secondary career path. So has that perception changed?
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, I'm 50-50 on this one. I should say 60-40, the 60% incredibly positive. So girls are coming through and it's a genuine career path now. The Aussie girls are earning very, very good money. But at the end of the day, it's not always about the money. It's more so that, look, you love sport, you have an opportunity to do your passion and live your passion. So whether it's as a player, as a coach, as a media broadcaster, there's options for females in sport. And I think that's the bottom line. Because as a player, you can't play forever. And it is really important to actually keep developing the young girls more broadly. The girls, as Mary said, the girls generally have a lot more perspective with it. But the biggest thing is the option to have it as a profession now provides opportunity to the young girls. And you know what? They might say, look, I don't really like cricket that much, but I like something else. And it's just opportunity and opening our perspectives to say that you can actually do anything as long as you love it and work hard, it's possible.
As you said, the career opportunities are beyond just playing cricket. So has the number of women in administration or coaching or even media covering both men's and women's sport increased in the last few years?
I think it's getting there. By far, it's better than it was. But I'd say the coaching department is still lacking a fair bit. There's a lot of drives. Australia, again, I think is leading the way, is getting females in sport. Media is pretty good. Mary can probably comment on that a little bit better than I can. It's getting there, but I still think there's a long way to go, if I'm honest.
Avi, I would agree with that. I think when I talk about women's sport, I think it's always important to really recognise how far we've come. But on the same hand, think about how much opportunity is still left and how far we still have to go. From a media perspective, what I think was really exciting was that when Channel 7 covered the WBBL last year, there were a lot of former players beginning to pop up in commentary. So in the past, when you used to watch the WBBL, often there were a lot of male commentators. And there's no problem with that. Men should be able to commentate women's sports just as women should be able to commentate men's sports. But it was just wonderful to see women like Katie Martin and Holly Furling actually getting involved in the coverage. And as former players, they have a wonderful perspective to bring. And we're very used to seeing former cricketers in the commentary box. So it was great to see more women being given that opportunity last year. And I really hope that continues.
Right. And as you said, it is not just, just the cricketers and the commentators. What about the younger girls coming through? The talent pool, has that changed? Are there more numbers at trials? Are there, as Bhavi mentioned, there are a lot more clubs now. So that, of course, feeds into the national team. And we've seen the Australian women's cricket team just grow from strength to strength. But at the more grassroots level, how has WBBL changed the perception, if not as a career, even as a more accepted hobby or a school sport?
I think at the most basic level, girls just know now that they can play cricket. You really can't be what you can't see. And growing up, I didn't know that women played cricket. Now, young girls can aspire to be the next Elise Villani or Elise Perry or Elisa Healy. And they have that option to play. And because of the WBBL, there's now women's cricket all around the country. So you can join your local club. Girls no longer have to play with the boys because for so many women in the WBBL now, that was their reality. And they grew up playing alongside the boys. That's not a problem, but, they didn't have the opportunity to play alongside girls. So what I'm most passionate about is that not only will the next generation of boys and girls know that just men and women play cricket, and that's just a really normal thing, that women have the opportunity to excel and have a professional career in cricket if that's what they want. But also the women and girls are just being given the opportunity to be fit and healthy and play a sport that they really love. That's I think, what excites me a lot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's the biggest thing for me. I could be wrong, but I believe female cricket has been the fastest growing sport in Australia for 4 or 5 years in a row. It's ridiculous. It's just gone 10x every year. And again, the WBBL plays such a big role in that. And it's the most pleasing for me is to see that. And the other side of it is what it does is it puts the pressure on other sports.
Yes.
So now, after WBBL led the way as probably Australia's most popular sport all around, AFL started coming through. NRL started coming through. Now netball, which is traditionally a female sport, but they realised, everyone's playing sport, we need to put more. And now all of a sudden, these young girls have an opportunity to do anything. Like literally any sport they can go and play. And I do think WBBL, being a primary sport in Australia, led the way with that.
Bobby, I couldn't agree more. And if I think back to last year and what were much simpler and happier times, I remember that one of the happiest days of my life was travelling down to Melbourne for the ICC T20 Women's World Cup final. Over 84,000 people in the stadium that day to watch Australia play India. It was a moment in time. It absolutely showed the world what is possible. And I think on that day, if we just even touch on Indian women's cricket, if I think about the talent in that squad, and apologies if I pronounce the names incorrectly, but the likes of Harmanpreet Kaur, Poonam Yadav, Shafali Verma, these are talents of the future. Imagine how much further they could go with similar opportunities to what we have here in Australia. It was a real show in time of what is possible, and it pushes other sports in other countries, I think, to think about what is possible and what they can do differently.
Absolutely. In fact, that is a often given argument that there isn't enough depth in Indian women's cricket to have a full-fledged league like the WBBL. But as you said, it is a cause and effect. On that note, we have a question from the audience, and was the domestic structure strong enough before WBBL came in? Because it would have needed a lot of domestic cricketers, which is similar to the argument in India. And would it be somewhere on par with the best, considering there are 8 teams to cater to? So, is there enough talent to cater to 8 teams? And what was the domestic structure like before WBBL? What were the contracts? Essentially, if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's, I think, where Australia is potentially a bit further ahead in the structure, and that you have 8 teams, and everyone was, when we say contracted, it's very, very minimal pay, but the structure was there. So you already had 8 teams of 14 to 15 girls playing at a national level for, I think, potentially 10 years prior to the WBBL in a fly-in, like home and away series. Prior to that, they used to say, here's a 2-week carnival, everyone go and play each other in 2 weeks. You fund it yourselves basically and carry on. So there was a 8-week structured period, 8 to 10 year structured period prior to WBBL starting, which made a huge difference. So the talent was already there in that aspect. The difference, I think, going towards India is if a lot of people are saying, there's not enough talent. Well, you've got 1.4 billion people, half of them are female. So there will be enough, and you have to start at a lower level. Like, that's okay. You have to cop the talent's not going to be there because there haven't been a structure to actually develop that yet. But you have to start somewhere. And that's where I think the difference in Australia, and even, as Mary mentioned, that World Cup, is the courage of certain leaders within the game. And that's where it comes down to, because Nick Hockley, who was the CEO of the ICC Women, said, yeah, we'll get 85,000 at the MCG or whatever it was, or 90,000 I think they're going for. Everyone within women's cricket said that's ridiculous. The old players, as players, we said that's the dumbest thing ever. This is so embarrassing. We're going to have half empty, like even if you get 20,000 into the MCG, it feels empty because it's a huge stadium. So everyone thought it was stupid, but they had courage to say no. Like we have a dream, we have a desire, we see the possibilities. It's grounded in this. We've got this much growth in women's cricket. If we put this investment in, something can happen. But it was a very, very courageous call. And then same with the investment in women's cricket. Even 10 years ago, before, as your question was, with the structure behind before WBBL, there was courage put into investing in women's cricket 10 years before the BBL even started. So yes, it wasn't growing at that rate, but someone had a vision. Someone saw cricket is popular. 50% of our population is female. A lot of females support cricket. Why don't we invest? Get good coaches in, get good money in, have the like. For me, it's all down to courage. It's the courage to see a possibility and actually follow through with it and take some risks, knowing that passion will drive you forward. And I think that's the big thing. We can sit here and discuss how great it is to have women playing cricket, but if you don't take action and invest, even though the talent or the skill or the structure's not there yet, you have to start somewhere.
And Bharvi, I couldn't agree more with you on that point. If we look at the WBBL, it did start with 8 teams, but another code that I love here in Australia is rugby league. And there are 14 men's teams in the 14 teams in the men's competition. The NRLW has only started with 4 teams because the focus has very much been on creating an exciting, sustainable, marketable competition. It is absolutely okay to start small, and then you can dream big and watch the competition grow as more people want to get involved with it.
So that was the question from Shama. Thank you. We have a couple of more questions. Kritika is asking whether the majority of the spectators that have shown interest in WBBL are women and girls, and how important is it to have both men and women in your audience, even though, you know, it is the Women's Big Bash League?
I would actually say that my observation has been that it's a good mix of men and women, because in the end, I really believe that sport is sport. And if I'm truly a cricket fan, whether it's men, women, kids watching, I'll always show an interest. But what I will say, one of my most favourite memories of the ICC T20 Women's World Cup was seeing all the dads bringing their daughters to the game. And it was just so lovely and touching and a really beautiful way to create a family bond. Be interested to hear Barbie's view, but from my view, men and women are loving the WBBL, and particularly given its quality, how excellent it is.
I actually think there's a lot more men still, to be honest. So initially my thoughts were, yep, it'll be young girls, some females that like it. The men will probably write it off, as they always do, saying it's not fast enough or it's the same as our 4th grade team or whatnot, even though I've played 2s and 1s for men in the men's system. But if I think about, say, when I was involved in WBBL and you're getting messages from people, you're reading comments, like it's actually still a lot more men that just love cricket. And there's a lot more people that are coming through and saying, yeah, I actually wrote it off in that first year, but the development and growth of it has come through so much. And now they're saying their wives, their daughters, their sisters are starting to say, oh, well, you like cricket and there's girls, so now we're all just going to sit down as a family and watch it. So I certainly don't think it's just women and girls watching and enjoying the game.
Right. Taking that forward, Pranav has asked about the historic revenue sharing agreement that happened in Cricket Australia. Of course, the decision makers would have been the board. And what do you think was the general attitude, you know, of the board? Because that would have been a very important deciding factor. Apart from the players standing, ultimately the decision makers are the administrators. So what was the general attitude towards getting towards equal pay?
It was pretty tough from a player's point of view. I was actually quite involved at the Australian Cricketers Association that year. All the negotiations were going down, and it was a hard slog. So if I'm honest, from what we were hearing as players, and the ACA worked so hard for 12 months to try get that to where it needed to be. But again, there were certain key administrators at Cricket Australia that ended up agreeing to it. And I think at the end of the day, that's made all the difference.
It definitely was a long campaign. Mary, if I could quickly bring you here on the role the media played, because as a journalist, perhaps I'm biased towards this, but I'm always interested to know what role does media play in promoting this cause, because you have to take it to the masses, right?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think media play a huge role in sharing the stories of the competition, but also in just covering the competition. And what I think actually is going to be another really important step, and one that's already started happening in Australia, is constructive criticism of women's sport. Now, I've been covering women's sport now for about 8 years, and I am such a fan of all our female athletes. And something that I've found hard in the past is to offer constructive criticism. But we're in a position where we are asking for equal pay, where we are moving to a model where our female cricketers are professional. And constructive criticism, I think, is a really important next step. But I think the media play a huge role. And I think as well, the players play a huge role too. And we're so fortunate with the quality of women in the WBBL that are so kind with their time. They have such wonderful stories and are just as passionate about growing the game as I am.
it was essentially a collective effort. Before we wrap up the session, I have a question which I'm sure a lot of the viewers do. What do you think are the main lessons that the Indian system can take from what is already a successful template? Of course, WBBL also started as an experiment. It worked, so we have a blueprint ready. But what do you think the biggest takeaway for India would be?
Just do it. If any administrators that are listening, you don't have the courage to do it because you have an extremely talented Indian women's cricket team. The sky's the limit for them, and do it for the next generation of boys and girls, particularly girls, and give them the opportunity to know that they can play the sport that they love. Just do it.
Bhavi, from the financial aspect and from the building of the system aspect, what would be your lessons for India?
I think you have to align the teams with men's teams so that the current IPL structure is so popular already, and going away from that is just stupid in my opinion. Like, it actually makes no sense whatsoever. 100% align it with the current teams. As Mary said earlier, don't be afraid to start small. Within that, you don't have to go to 8 full-fledged teams or 12 or whatever it is. Like, you can start with 4 teams, but how about make the franchises bid for that? So if you want a team in the IPL, you've got to put forward a proposal as to how you're going to make it work. Now you know that the teams bidding for a women's team or the clubs bidding for a women's team actually want it. So if they want it, they're going to put the resources into it, aren't they? And they're going to actually put the structures behind it. And that's huge. So I think if you can align it with, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, align it with what's already working. Be smart with the talent pool. You don't have to go large. And I can't go wrong with what Mary said. Just do it.
Right. We have another question from Prasen. He's asking about the reactions from Indian women cricketers. The men's team aren't allowed to play leagues abroad, but a concession was made for the women's team and they did play WBBL. And I know that Harmanpreet and Smriti Mandhana both mentioned how important it was, especially for the 2017 World Cup campaign. So have you heard anything from Indian players or from the Indian ecosystem in general about the WBBL?
Is that more so players, like whether players can come here?
What are some of the reactions you've had from Indian women cricketers? If you've had conversations with them, their thoughts about the WBBL, if you've had any interaction?
I think all of them, from my perspective, every single one of them want to come here and play. It's the strongest league. A lot of the girls that played, particularly at the Stars, we had a lot of big international cricketers, none of them from India, but all of them said the BBL is a higher standard than the vast majority of international cricket. So it's the best league in the world with the best players. What better place to develop your talent? And more importantly, in my perspective, develop your perspective or field. You're living in a different country for 2 months with people who may not speak the same language as you, in a new environment, but world-class systems. So if you're going to develop as a cricketer, absolutely. I think every single one of them love it out here. They all want to come out here. It's just a matter of the cap limits on how many internationals you can have.
And can I say as well, from a media and a fan perspective, going into the 2020 Women's World Cup, it was an absolute delight to know so many of the women on competing teams. And the reason that I know those women so well is because English internationals, New Zealand internationals and Indian internationals all come out to Australia to play in the WBBL because it is the best women's competition in the world. So that was such a pleasure. And I know Australian fans get an absolute kick out of seeing the internationals come. I mean, I'll never forget Poonam Yadav on the opening night of the T20 Women's World Cup. It wasn't a particularly happy night for me, but Australians were absolutely in awe. This pocket rocket came out of nowhere and absolutely led to an Australian batting collapse. So we love it. And the more Indian women that can come out, the better, because we just love it.
Right. And if I could just add, whoever I have spoken to who's played in the WBBL had only good things to say about it. But the most tangible effect would have been the 2017 World Cup semi-final. Again, it may not be a very happy memory, but it was, I think that was a very important effect, what participating in leagues like this can mean for Indian players. Before we wrap up, because I see that we are nearing the end of our session, and our time limit. Is there anything you'd like to add about the growth, the impact, the evolution of WBBL? Something that we missed out on?
I'd just like to say a really big thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting, and Barbie, I think you are an absolute superstar. I'd just encourage everyone to get behind women's sport. So not only watch it, but if you've got the opportunity, actually go out and get your bottom on a seat, because that's what shows broadcasters, that's what shows the media that there's an interest in it. So if you want to know what you can personally do to help support the cause, that's it. Turn on your televisions and go watch sport.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's about what can you control, what can you do within your circle, and all of that adds up. So we don't need to change the world. There will be challenges. So there will be old school people who do not want change. But if each individual does whatever they can to show the support they can for women's cricket, I think, honestly, the IPL, and you speak to every single women's cricketer in the world, irrelevant of what country they're saying, every single one says the women's IPL is everything. If the women's IPL kicks off, it changes women's sport globally. It's the linchpin. And if we can do whatever we want, whatever we can to overcome those little challenges by doing whatever you can to support the game, I think that's everything.
Because women's IPL remains a pipe dream, but hopefully we are one step closer to it. And this symposium has been a wonderful platform to make the case for women's IPL and a women's structure. Thank you so much, Bhavi. Thank you, Mary. It was wonderful chatting with you. And we should continue this discussion offline as well. Thank you. Over to you, Yogita.
Thank you, Zinia. Thank you so much, Mary, Bhavi, and Zinia, for that session. I think it's offered us plenty of lessons and inspiration for us to take back to women's cricket in India.